Hello, and welcome to the Vicedom Crafts Cookie Cutter Gingerbread Christmas Decoration video. This is some of the materials that I've used whilst making this craft. So there's the star cookie cutter. I've also used the stocking cookie cutter before to make a decoration. You'll need some felt material. I use a combination of wool and synthetic. It's a bit sturdier other than the synthetic felt. Then you'll need a pen. I prefer heat erasable pens. I also use some interfacing on the back of my felt to reinforce it. You'll need a ruler to mark out the embroidery. Scissors, obviously, to cut out the shapes. The embroidery floss, in this case in a white colour because I'm going for a gingerbread theme. And I've gone for a candy cane cord to hang the decoration. There's some seed beads in your choice of colour and some needles, preferably about a size 7 to 9 would be good for this craft. So you're going to begin by drawing around your cookie cutter shape twice in the felt because you need a front and a back piece that you'll sandwich together when you sew the piece later on. So I would use a heat erasable pen, although in this case I have just used a normal pen because my heat erasable ones have run out. So I've used one in a similar colour to the felt so you can't really see it once it's cut out. Once you have your two felt pieces, I like to use interfacing to iron onto the back of the piece. That just reinforces it slightly. When you look at interfacing, you will see that it's got a rough, bobbly side. That is the side with the glue. That needs to be the piece that is the side that's against the material. And then the smooth side is the piece that you iron. So as you can see here, there's the star shape with the interfacing ironed onto the back. Now I'm just folding the star into quarters to try and find a central point so we can start the design of the piece. I'm actually using a prim chalk pencil to mark out my design on the front of the decoration, but you can also do it on the back and use the back as a guide or use a heat erasable pen. So after you've drawn out the basic design on both sides of the decoration, you need to grab your embroidery floss. So embroidery floss comes in 6 strands. In this instance, I'm only going to use 2, so you need to separate those. So how I do this is, as you can see, is comb out the end of the section which I've cut off, and you can see I've pulled 2 strands aside. Then I hold those strands apart and use my thumb to gently ease the threads apart. I prefer this way of doing it rather than pulling the threads through because I find that knots quite a lot. So this is the way I was taught to do it. So this is where I'm showing you. So before threading your needle, I advise snipping off the end just to make the threads nice and even. Then select your needle with a suitable size hole to fit the 2 threads through, but also make sure that you can fit a seed bead over your needle that you've selected. It will just save you later on. So before you start sewing, if you knot the end of your thread so that the whole thread doesn't pull through, it's just an anchor for the stitches essentially. You can thread it in, but I prefer to do a knot in this instance. So I've chosen to do a stem stitch on this decoration, which looks like a twisted rope-like texture. So if you come up into the center of the decoration, and then create a small stitch, and you will see that I am holding that floss to the left hand side, and then you come up halfway between the center of that stitch, pull the thread through and up, and as you make the next stitch, you will see how it starts to form a rope. But I hold it over to the left again, form a stitch, pull that through, come halfway up, and at this point you can let the left hand loop go and pull straight, and just keep repeating this stem stitch all the way to the top of the star. So we're coming up to the last stitch here. I don't sew right to the edge because the stitches can tend to fall off. So you need to leave a little bit of a gap. But once you've pulled that thread through on the half, you come back down at the end of that stitch, and that's where that embroidery stitching ends. So to create the snowflake design, you're going to equally draw diagonal lines down that central stitching. Then we're going to stem stitch again along that design. So you can see there that I wove my thread into some of the stitching along the back of the star, and that is so that I can get to the line that I have drawn to do the diagonal stitching upwards. So at the top, I'm only going to use one stem stitch because there's not actually a lot of room in the top of the point. So you just come up in one stitch, then halfway into the middle, and then back down into the end length of that stitch. And that's all we do at the top of that snowflake design there. Then you're going to bring your needle back up the other side of the central embroidery stem stitch line to form the symmetrical stem stitch the other side of that point of the star. So again, to get down to the next level of stitching that you need to do, I weave my thread into the back of the stitches on the central stem stitch, and then repeat the stem stitching on either side, as you can see here. And I've used 2 stem stitches for those bottom levels. Then I'm just weaving the thread into the back of the piece again. It just anchors it and also helps you to get the thread in the right place for the next central line of the stem stitch. So here you can see that stem stitch repeated for each point on the star. Now there's not enough thread for me to carry on sewing to do the seed bead embroidery on the design. So I'm now weaving those threads into the back of the piece to anchor it in. And then I'm going to form a knot with one of the stitches. and cut the thread. Once you've completed one side of the star, you can repeat the process with the second, and then we can go on to the seed beads. So on this case, I've chosen clear seed beads, but you can choose any color you wish. Just make sure before you start that the seed bead actually fits over your entire needle. And I've come up in the central point as the points of the star come in towards the center. Not too close to the edge because obviously you'll be sewing both sides together. Once you have your seed bead loaded onto your needle and embroidery thread, if you come across the star in just a straight running stitch, I usually try to do it slightly wider than the width of the seed bead. I find that the seed bead lays flatter on the surface of the material if it's just slightly wider than the bead. And then you continue sewing the beads on around the design. I'm keeping it to the same sort of place. You don't have to. You can sew your beads in anywhere you wish to on your snowflake. So once you've sewn all your seed beads around the edge of the design, I also like to sew a single bead into the center. I think it just pulls it all together. So once you've sewn that central bead, you can knot the thread on the back of the design. So as before, I weave the needle and thread into some of the back of the stitches and then form a knot and cut off. Once you've sewn your design onto both pieces of the decoration, it's time to fix the cord to the inside. And I'm using a candy cane cord, but you can also use ribbon or anything that you have to hand. I form a loop in the desired length that I would like the decoration to be when it's on my tree. There's no set right or wrong answer with regards to the size of the hanging cord. It's personal choice. It's up to you. So then I fold that cord in half and join the ends together, and I'm just going to place a knot in the end here, and this knot will be concealed inside the decoration. I'm now going to glue the knotted cord onto the back piece of the decoration at the very top point. So I'm using fast tack glue for this, but I've also used fabric glue in the past. It's wherever you have to hand really, that will just hold that cord in place, not only for added security for when you're hanging it, but it also helps to be glued in whilst you're sewing. When I'm placing the cord onto the decoration into the glue, I like to bring the knot down a little, so it's further into the center of the decoration. And this also helps when you're actually sewing it together, so the knot isn't right at the top and it's not in the way, and you're not trying to force the needle through that. Once the glue is dried, you can then place the two pieces of the decoration together. Now, I like to use quilting clips to hold mine together, but you can also use pins if you have them to hand. I've also just held them together with my fingers before. It's whatever you find easier. But I'm going to show you in this instance how to do it with quilting clips. So I join the points of the star together. Obviously, it's going to be a slightly 3D shape. So if you join the points, generally, you'll have a good seam going right the way around the edge of the decoration. Once you have your decoration piece all clipped together, it's time to start sewing. Now, I use a blanket stitch around the edge of my decorations. I use a fairly long piece of thread. I would say at least double the circumference of what you believe the decoration to be, because the blanket stitch does take up quite a lot of thread. So to start, you make a knot in the end of the thread, and you're going to come in between the two layers of the star, and you're going to come out of the front. I'd say the length of my stitches are only a few millimeters, really. My blanket stitch is really small. I prefer it that way. I find it a lot neater. But you can make larger blanket stitches if you prefer. Once you've wedged that knot in between the two layers of felt, it's time to come into the back of the decoration. So you come in on this first stitch, you come in through the back and out where the thread was originally coming out the front. Um, don't pull the thread completely taut. You need to keep a loop there, so that when the needle is coming out the front of the decoration again, as you can see here, there's going to be a loop. Make sure it's not all twisted and it's open, but then you come in from the in through the loop front to back, and then pull that outwards. And then again, to carry on with the stitch, you're going to come in a couple of millimeters down, widthways and lengthways down, and come back to the front, forming that loop again. Make sure it's not twisted, go through the loop and pull outwards, and just repeat this all the way around the decoration. It's slightly different when you get to the point. We'll come to that in a moment and I'll talk you through it. Once you come to the point of a star, we're going to make 3 blanket stitches. The 2 outer ones are going to be at a diagonal, and then there's going to be one central one at the tip of the point. So the entrance and exit of the thread into the decoration is going to be slightly at a diagonal, and you will see that shortly. When it comes to sewing around the cord, you're going to pull both sides of the cord to the right slightly and place a blanket stitch up against the left-hand side of the left cord. That will pin that side in place, and you probably will feel the needle going through some of the fibers of that cord in the center of the decoration. That's fine, it's just anchoring that cord in. Now you're going to do a center stitch in between the cord loop. So how I do that is I pull that cord forward with the hanging cord pulled forward over the front of the decoration, slightly separate either side, and you're going to do another blanket stitch back to the front. Then as you pull the thread through to the front, you're going to go back through the loop that is forming on the back of the decoration, as you have done as you've sewn all the way round thus far. You'll see that blanket stitch you've just formed sitting in between the two sides of the hanging cord there. Now to do the next side, the right hand side, you're going to pull both lengths of the hanging cord over to the left and hold it with your fingers, and then you're going to do another blanket stitch right next to that right hand side cord, and you will find that the needle will go through some of those fibers in the middle. That's absolutely fine, and just do another blanket stitch there. So it's very similar to when you sew just the normal point of the star with the 3 stitches, but you're incorporating the cord in that now as well. Now you can just carry on sewing that blanket stitch around the entirety of the decoration, but leaving the final point so that we can add some stuffing and make it more of a 3D shape before we finally sew it up completely. So when you're left with that final point unsewn, you'll see there's an opening there for you to add the stuffing. I often purchase hypoallergenic pillows and use the stuffing from those in my decorations, but you can also purchase stuffing from craft stores. I use some locking clamp forceps to help with my stuffing. They're very good for getting into the points of decorations or anything that you make, but you can also use the blunt end of a pencil. I find I get a better result with stuffing if I use small pieces at a time. That way you're able to manipulate the innards so that it goes into all of the small crevices and crooks and crannies of anything that you're making. So as you see here, I've got a small piece of stuffing that I'm going to work into the middle of the decoration and right into that top point past the knot. I like to add small pieces of stuffing to each point of the star before I fill the rest of the piece. When you come to stuffing the center of the decoration, you can feel with your fingers when you're squeezing it if there's gaps. So just use your fingers. If you feel a gap, add a little bit more stuffing until you get to a point where you have that last point of the star that's not sewn together, just separated, and the stuffing in the middle with no gaping holes, basically. Once you're happy with the level of filling that you've placed in your decoration, it's time to sew up that final point of the star. So pinching those two pieces together rather than clipping, I sew a blanket stitch down one side and over the point before I sew any further. I then add some stuffing. Once you've reached that final point of the star, you're left with a very small opening to add the remainder of the stuffing. So just take a small piece at a time. You may have to do it in very, very small increments as you start to fill that last point. Now you can also use a felting needle to compact the stuffing into the decoration if you so wish. I haven't done on this occasion. I'm just gently filling that final point, and then you'll see that I will pinch those two sides together and continue the blanket stitch down until the decoration is closed up completely. On the final closing stitch, you'll see that I come in through the back, but the needle comes out through the very first stitch at the front. And then as you come back, you're going to tuck the needle under that thread which is hanging over the edge of the decoration on that first stitch. You then also pull the needle through the loop of thread that you have made with the stitch you've just made. That then joins up the very first blanket stitch that you made with the very last. Now, to finish the decoration, I place the needle in between the two sides of the star on that very last stitch and come out the other side of the decoration. This will pull that cord into the stuffing and pull fairly tightly, giving it a little squeeze, and then you're going to cut that thread off. You'll then find that the ends of your thread for your blanket stitch are contained within the inside of the decoration, so they won't be seen. And there you have it. You've completed your star-shaped cookie cutter gingerbread decoration for your Christmas tree. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing or commenting. I'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.